So I've been enjoying this series in some ways, and in other ways I find the series challenging. I think anytime we think about what it means to be lost, what it means to be in the dark wood, is not always a happy time, it's not always a comforting time. But at the same time, there's this idea in which we're invited to be present in those moments. But more often than not, we find ourselves maybe like Bruce. I would suspect that some of you, maybe all of us, but at least some of you, like me, have gone so far as to step outside of your car and scream up at the sky. Or if not then, maybe walked out of your house in the middle of the night and screamed, or taken a pillow and gone downstairs and screamed. I suspect that some of you, like me, like Bruce, have wondered, where in the world is the stairway to heaven? And when somebody came in earlier, and I'm not remembering now who it was that said this to me, but as they came in and we looked at the bulletin and saw we were doing Stairway to Heaven, and the question was, so are you going to show us how to build one? And maybe so. Maybe so. Maybe in fact, yes. Maybe the fact, though, of course, with Bruce, as we noticed in this wonderful clip, was that the stairway was there all along. He just didn't see it. This story about the prophet Elijah is one of those interesting power struggle stories that we find in the context of the Old Testament, and we find in the context of our Judeo-Christian roots. We're talking about Elijah, prophet of the northern kingdom in the 9th century BCE. So he's in the time of Ahab as the ruler. He's in the time of when the Canaanites have a huge influence in the Israelites, and already they're trying to make sort of negotiations, relationships with the Canaanites to kind of establish a little more of a sense of control and relationship there. Again, there's so much power that's involved in religious life and vice versa, especially in the Old Testament, and even in New Testament Christianity early on, especially as we move toward the 4th century and Constantine and Constantinople. There's a lot of power that gets caught up in this understanding of what is religion and what is spirituality, and where we find God in the midst of that. And Elijah is furious because he's looking for the pure faith. He's looking to get back to this pure worship of Yahweh, when already some of the other priests are sort of inviting Canaanite gods, Baal, the main Canaanite god, to have temples built to that god, and to have priestesses come in to sort of begin to mesh a little bit, and he's reacting against that. And yet at the same time, a lot of the prophets around him are being killed, and so his own life is threatened, and is true for anyone who sort of bucks up against the system. Life can get a little precarious, and finally he finds himself on the run, wondering where God is in the midst of all of this, and finds himself hiding out. I suspect there have been times when you yourself have found yourself at odds, at a loss, confused, perhaps in the midst of something despairing. And where do we turn when that happens? Where do you turn when that happens? Is there someone to whom you turn? Or is there a place to whom you run? Or as I was having fun sharing with some of my family the other day, and we were talking about the wonderful family dynamics that make up, talking about power and relationship and spirituality, right? The wonderful little struggles that make up those things. And they were sharing with me how this person was doing that, and they just keep on doing that. And I was like smiling and going like, yeah, they've been doing that for 10 years now. Yeah, I know, for 10 years this has been happening. And I'm going, you must really like it. It must feel really familiar to you. How many of us find ourselves falling back into those patterns as a way of trying to deal with the very problems we think we're facing? But the familiar sometimes seems to be so much more comfortable, even when it is somewhat self-destructive. We'll tend to fall back on what's familiar. Part of that is our physiology. We can't help it. I don't think you need to go home feeling ashamed of yourself, because we do this all the time. We fall back on the familiar. Our brains are designed to be simple. Our brains are designed to find the fastest way from A to B, or to C through B. And so it's going to go to the familiar, even if the familiar is self-destructive. We have to work sometimes, which is the benefit, which is the joy, which is the opportunity that I think we have here today in getting lost. Not so much in being lost, but in seeking to get lost. The challenge for that, of course, is that we want to kind of go for the answer. So we look for the earthquake, right? We look for the big thing. It shakes our foundation, and God's going to come in just like, sort of like the big problem. There's a big fix, and then there's no God, as the text says. God wasn't in the earthquake. So then we look at this wind. We look at life when it just sort of bends us to the point of almost breaking. We once again look for God, but God isn't in that. And then we look for God in the lightning. We look for God in all of these big ways. And then it turns out God shows up, always present, in these small, tiny, almost imperceptible signs that are on the road right in front of us as we're heading down the highway. Or the person sitting next to us right now this morning perhaps said something, or perhaps they know something, or perhaps if we actually took a moment simply to open up and say, I've been wondering about this. Is it possible that that person could be the voice of God in some way? The still small voice that's almost imperceptible. We turn outward when sometimes those familiar patterns are simply taking us down the same paths. There's a wonderful book that I have that I actually have not read yet. It's a wonderful book on mindfulness. I like this quote. I like this statement at the end when God says in that still small voice, Elijah, why are you here? You know, it's kind of like, where are you? Why are you here? What's going on? Are you really present to the moment? And the book is called Wherever You Go, There You Are. I just love that title. It could be sort of like my mantra. Wherever I go, here I am. Instead of worrying about where I'm supposed to be next. So Thich Nhat Hanh, many of you know him, the Vietnamese, the Buddhist, who has been so influential in peace movements around the world, but also with his own country and his own culture. But he's been a big part of Buddhism and mindfulness in the Western world as well. And he wrote this thing earlier last year called interbeing. He came up with this term called interbeing. Now, we've talked about interconnectedness, but I like this idea of interbeing. So you pick up this paper, right? Go ahead, you pick it up, right? Pick it up and look at this paper. And what we never realize is what this paper is. This paper is cloud. This paper is cloud. This paper is sunshine. This piece of paper is a logger in Colorado, perhaps, or maybe East Texas, who was sustained by bread and water and food, whose mother gave birth, whose father and mother raised him, whose father might have been a logger as well. This piece of paper is rain and sunshine and water. All of those elements go into this. And yet, because we tend to think in terms of black and white, because we tend to think of terms as big, hit us in the head, or we're going to miss the point, we miss the connection. We miss the reality that we are somehow interconnected to a much bigger picture all the time, every moment. And as a result, we get caught up in our own little narratives and forget that we're part of this amazing interconnected narrative. So years ago, I've shared this story before, and I'm going to try to share this in a minute here, just a briefer one. I want us to think, I almost forgot. There's something else that goes into this paper that we take for granted. And we enjoy it. We sit back and we say, boy, the Led Zeppelin was fun. The band did Led Zeppelin. They do awesome music. It was so great. Some of you actually sit back and you actually look at the whole thing, and you read the quotes that are on the back, and you start trying to think about, what does that have to do with the title? And what does that have to do with the May the Road? And then we did this Anam Cara, Soul Friend. What is Soul Friend anyway? Some of you actually go there. I don't pity you. I think that's a good thing. Your mind starts wandering. It's a little bit more work on the brain, but some of us really go there, and we start to realize Sharm is in here. Sharm Robarts is in this paper. Brad Thompson is in this paper. But not just Brad, then all sorts of the band members are in this paper, because we're thinking, what will Mike do when he gets to that bass line in Stairway to Heaven? How much fun is he going to have with that? And already Brad and I are celebrating a moment that hasn't even happened, but is already happening in our hearts, because we are already participating in this life that is so much bigger than us. All of that is in this piece of paper. And some of you are just going to leave it on the floor when you walk out. So much magic. But we take it for granted. We do. I do too. We all do. We don't see that interbeing of which we are a part. Rebecca Solnit wrote a nice book. Her name is Solnit. I recommend, if you haven't read anything by Rebecca Solnit, that you ought to read something by her. She is a fascinating, amazing writer who is simply connected to so much larger than herself. But she wrote this wonderful book a couple of years ago called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. And she speaks about about how we need to find those times where we force ourselves, where we encourage ourselves to simply get lost. We have to become disoriented sometimes in order to discover something larger, to perhaps discover something that's right at the heart of who we already are. We have to do this. In the deepest and most mysterious ways, we begin to see these connections, to look at things strange. She quotes Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau. He says, "Not till we are completely lost or turned around do we appreciate the vastness and strangeness of all life." Not till we are lost. In other words, not till we have lost the world do we begin to find ourselves and realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relationships. She says Thoreau is playing with that biblical question. That biblical idea of what does it profit a person if he or she gains the whole world but loses their soul? But on the other hand, if you lose the whole world and you get lost in it, what are the possibilities that you might actually find your soul? Instead of getting caught up in trying to buy that stairway to heaven and trying to build that stairway to heaven, sitting still enough in the strange to suddenly realize the doorways to heaven are in every single moment. The opportunities for connection are always there. So I went to Flint, Michigan, probably 15 years ago. 12 to 15 years ago, I went to Flint, Michigan. Some of you remember this. I'm going to do this shorter version. But I went there. It was in November, and I was invited as a storyteller. I was no longer in the local church as a pastor, but I'd been traveling to churches, telling stories, talking about the power of our stories to open us up to one another, to open us up to God's story and such and such. And so they invited me to go to Flint, Michigan. How many of you been to Flint, Michigan? Nice. Okay, a few more than I would have expected. Yeah. So Flint, Michigan is this beautiful mountainous town that is just surrounded by lakes and mountains and trees and... No, okay. Yeah. So Flint, Michigan is sort of what you would think. It's an automotive industry town. It's about an hour or so outside of Detroit, north of Detroit. I flew into Flint. I'd never been to Michigan. I had no understanding of Michigan whatsoever, other than I knew that Detroit was in Michigan, and it was somewhere south in Michigan. So I flew into Flint, and I did this workshop with about 100 ministers, men and women, Methodist mostly, but Disciples of Christ and Presbyterians. I told this one story about Hoja, the wise fool of the East, as I was opening up the workshop and exploring the nature of finding ourselves, the nature of telling our stories and discovering things. And I said, Hoja once was looking for his key outside of his house. The wise fool of the Middle East was once looking for his key outside, and it was a bright day, and he was looking in the bush, and some of his friends said, Hoja, what are you doing? He said, I've lost my key. I can't get inside. And they said, well, where did you lose it? And he said, well, I left it inside. And they said, well, why are you looking for it out here? And he said, because there's more light. That was kind of the response I was hoping to get when I told the story. But instead, it was just this flat affect, kind of deadpan looking at me, a couple of people smiling knowingly, and a couple of others kind of just shaking their heads a little bit. And the whole day went like that. And after the end of the day, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in the wrong business. I should not be doing this. I am terrible at this. And I just embarrassed myself in front of these ministers, and it's a Saturday afternoon, and it's about 4 o'clock. Again, it's mid-late November, not quite towards the week before Thanksgiving. And so I look at the guy who brought me up there, and he says, well, what do you think? And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, oh, we loved it. And I said, I'm wondering if there's a place tonight where I might go and have like some coffee and here's some other storytelling, some like a coffee house. And he said, well, we got a Denny's on the edge of town. It's on Interstate 75 going out of town. There's a Denny's. And I said, well, no. I'm looking more like for storytelling. And he said, well, that's at the library, and it's closed. And I said, okay, I don't know. And I said, wait a minute. Detroit's not far, right? I've always thought Detroit might be kind of fun. Detroit's a big city. He says, yeah, it's a big city. If you want to go there at night on a Saturday night. And I said, well, yeah, I think I would. And I said, how do I get there? And he says, well, you'll need a car. So I was like, so okay, can you take me to car? It wasn't part of my budget, but he takes me to a rent car. I get a rent car. It's a Geo Metro. I don't know if you guys remember Geo Metros. It was a 5-speed with 3 cylinders. And I thought there's a little bit of an imbalance there, but it should get me there. And the guy promised. He said, it'll get you there. It'll get you there. So I get in the car, and he says, so where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to Detroit. How do I get there? He said, just head south on Interstate 75. You can't miss it. It'll run right into town. And I said, that's awesome. And he says, well, what are you going to Detroit for on a Saturday night? I said, well, because I'm kind of looking for maybe a coffee house with maybe some music and some storytelling. And he says, you mean like at the library? And I said, no. He said, well, it's closed anyway. I said, I know. He says, there's a Denny's. I said, no, I don't want to go to Denny's. So I get in the car and I head south on Interstate 75, and I'm going about, 30 minutes or so, and it's about 5:30, and I get caught in rush hour traffic. I'm not but about 10 miles outside the city limits or so of Flint, and the first snowstorm of November hits. And it shuts things down, and I'm excited because I don't see snow very often, and I think it's an adventure, and so I'm kind of excited, but everybody else is being cautious. And so I'm navigating my way through this traffic when I realize I am stuck, and it's not moving. And after about 45 minutes of actually just creepy crawling, I may have been on the highway for almost an hour creepy crawling. I actually was teaching myself songs on my ukulele. While I was sitting there, I actually learned 2 new songs for Christmas while I was sitting there. So I finally decided this is going nowhere. I'm pulling off the road. I saw some lights on the side of the road. I didn't realize, but I was just outside of Pontiac, just on the north side of Pontiac, Michigan. And I got off the highway, finally got to the bridge, crossed over, and what did I see? Denny's! I kid you not, I pulled right into a Denny's. It was like destiny, right? So I pull into a Denny's, and the woman at the hostess says, what? So she says, are you by yourself? I said, yeah, I'm by myself. And she said, oh, and you're not from here? And I said, no, I'm kind of lost, but I'm from Texas. And she said, you're not kind of lost. You're like really lost. And I said, no, I was heading to Detroit because I was hoping to find some storytelling. She said, you mean like at the library? I said, no, I meant like at a club or coffee house. She said, well, this is the only coffee house, So I sat down, I had some dinner, and I thought, I'm heading back. I'm supposed to preach the next day at a church somewhere. So I finished dinner, and the waitress comes and says, the snow's letting up. You could still get to Detroit. And it was only about 8:30 or so. And so she said, you could still get to Detroit, and if you go straight down into the heart of Detroit, the highway goes right to it, you get to a place called Renaissance Center. It's enormous, this big, massive glass structure, buildings, they have restaurants. She said, I bet there's a bookstore in there. She said, you'll probably find a place like a club right around the block. You could listen to music and stuff. She said, you'll love it. So I said, awesome. Now, is it really easy? Now, remember, this is pre-GPS, right? I'm at the mercy of whatever the elements and whoever gives me directions. And I said, are you sure this will get me there? She said, stay on I-75. It goes down to like a big multi-boulevard thing, and you'll hit right at the center of town, and you'll run right into Renaissance Center, park in the garage. So I get in my Geo Metro, get back on, determined to at least get something out of the trip. And as I get into Detroit, it's exactly what she said. The snow had lifted. I'm finding myself narrowing down to a traffic-filled, multiple-laned boulevard, and I come to a big stoplight, and I see this massive glass building structure. My heart begins to pound because I think I finally got somewhere, and I'm excited. And I get into the turn lanes. I have to turn right in order to turn left to get into the turn lanes for the parking garage. I'm in the outside turn lane, and as the light turns green, the 2 lanes are turning left. The leftmost lane goes into the parking garage. The right turn lane starts to head down a slope, and the last thing I remember seeing was a sign over the tunnel that said, "Welcome to Canada." Now, if you don't think I'm disoriented at that moment, wondering how can you head south in the United States and go to Canada? Because I'd never been to Detroit, and when about 10 minutes later or so, when I come out the other side, and I come out into the Windsor customs agents there in those booths, and I finally pull up and I say, and he says, "Why are you here?" I honestly say, "I don't know. I have no idea how I got here." And he says, "Well, where are you from?" And I said, "From Texas." And he says, you are lost. And I said, you don't know the half of it. I said, I was just trying to find some storytelling or some kind. And he said, you mean like at a library? And I said, no, I mean like at a coffee house. And he said, most people come to Windsor because of the nightclubs. You know, drinking age is 18 over here. So you come on a Saturday night, all you're going to find is just clubs, clubs, clubs. And I thought, well, that's not what I was trying to do. So I said, now again, this is pre-2001, right, pre-9/11, so I just had to show my driver's license, basically. And he said, I'll tell you what, if you want, you can loop all the way back around and go back down in the tunnel. And I said, is there another way to get back across besides going under the ocean? Going under the lake? And he said, yeah, there's a bridge about 4 miles down that crosses over. And so I said, great. So I got on that main road that follows along the shore of the lake, and I'm driving toward the bridge. It's nighttime, it's almost 10, when a light and a stone glass building catches my eye, and it's a bookstore, and it's across this boulevard, and I pull into the bookstore, and I get out, and I think, all right, the light's on, I'm going to at least get something, a book from Canada to tell my wife, look at how lost I got and how much fun I had. And I walk in, and the bookstore's locked, but I'm inside the main door of this building. It kind of has a hallway that goes to other rooms, and I'm trying to get through this French glass door, but it's clearly locked, and I'm knocking on it when a woman comes up behind me and says, can I help you? And I said, well, I see there's a bookstore. And she says, well, you're pretty perceptive. And I said, well, no, but I was trying to see if it was open. And she says, well, you're not so perceptive, because it's locked. And I said, yeah, but I was looking for some story collection or something. She said, story? And I said, yeah. She said, you're looking for story? I said, yeah. She said, come with me. Kid you not, she took me down the hallway. She put me in a room, a small cafe room, 7 or 8 tables, 4 or 5 people seated at each table, a row of 3 or 4 author-looking type people, very nicely dressed. I'm in jeans and basically a T-shirt. And she sits me down next to a woman who, at the time, I'm about 38, 37, and she looked to be about 70 or so, and she said in a whisper, she said, this is Mrs. Story. And I said, excuse me? And she said, you were looking for Gertrude Story. And I just kind of went, no. But then Gertrude was next to me and tapped me, and she said, do I know you? And I said, I don't think so. And then the man who was standing up there by the name of Glenn Sortstadt, who was about to read from his poetry, said, I want to read from a new collection of my poems called East of Eden. This one takes place in Fort Worth, Texas. And it's entitled, Whatever Happened to Jane Giroux? Some of you might remember Jane Giroux, who was the 1966 Miss America, who was one of our local news hosts and anchors here in Fort Worth, who moved back to Oklahoma after she'd done her stint here and began to start some nonprofits there. And the guy was about to read, and I raised my hand and I said, I know. He said, you know what? I said, I know what happened to Jane Giroux. He said, who are you? And I said, I'm Tom McDermott. He says, why do you know her? And I said, because I'm from Fort Worth, Texas. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I don't know. The long and the short of it is that it was funny. I mean, it really was a funny turn of events. But at the conclusion, Gertrude got up and she read from a story of this little collection. It's called How to Saw Wood with an Angel. She has a wonderful little tribute into it that she gave me, or not tribute, but a little quote that she put in here and signed it for Tom, a new friend who knows there are no accidents. May his angel and his love of story guide him wherever he goes. And then she put in parentheses, there's always a story around the next corner. But after listening and visiting with her and with Glenn Sortstadt, it was so interesting to discover these connections. And then I even realized how far we'd both come. They came from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. They were 1,230 miles away from their home finishing up a writer's tour. I came from Fort Worth, Texas. I was 1,230 miles or so away from them as well. And we both end up in Windsor, Canada. And what are the odds, you know? And the next day when I finally got to the church where I was preaching, I didn't realize my host picked me up, took me and said, by the way, you're preaching at an all African-American church tomorrow morning. It's an AME church. It's an old traditional African Methodist Episcopal church. I said, I've never spoken to a completely different ethnic population and that I had no real experience with. And I was suddenly overwhelmed. And the guy looked at me and he said, well, this ought to be interesting then. And as I had a chance to visit with a few folks ahead of time, I was talking to a woman, and she asked where I was from, and I told her this story. And the further we talked about it, the more we got into our past, how she had grown up in an alcoholic family. And I started talking about my alcoholic family. And before we knew it, we found connections far greater than my own prejudices or limited perspectives had any idea. And when I stood up in the pulpit, I basically just put my notes aside and said, let me tell you a story. And after I shared the story of what had happened the night before and shared some personal stories about growing up in a broken home, afterwards a woman came up to me and she said, there was something you said today that just spoke to me, like this was a real God moment. And that was my first experience of what has since been those experiences of God moments all the time. They're all God moments. Invite the band to come on up. They're going to finish with a song here. And while they're coming up, I'll share with you just one tiny little anecdote that happened on Friday at Dallas Blooms. I was finishing up our walking around with Linda, and as we looked at all the beautiful flowers over there, it was crowded. Quinceañera photographs, pre-wedding photographs, photographs for the annual, and kids and families. It was just packed with people. One small little 4-year-old boy was staring at that big crystal pool that's in front of that lovely mansion-like house that's there on the property. And as he's staring at that pool, he's looking at the koi. And I'm thinking, look at those koi, how they just snap, they just chase, they look for food. They're just looking quick, just they know somebody's going to feed them. They're just rushing for that food. Wherever they see the body kind of move, they gravitate. And the boy stops because he sees something else. And when I kind of look over, he sees the geese that are flying above in the sky. And they're flying in that V formation. And as they fly over this kind of chaotic setting in their little V formation, I kind of smile. The little boy looks at his mom and says, "Do they know how to spell?" And I laughed to myself for a moment, and his mom says, "Nah, they just fly that way," and they walk off. And I thought, oh, if I missed it. I missed the opportunity. I missed the moment. But it's always there, right? They're always there, those moments that say, if you're in the midst of confusion, if you're feeling lost, if you're feeling overwhelmed, sometimes, if you just sit still enough, there are signs everywhere that remind us, lean in a little bit, be present a little bit. God is all around.